Hello and welcome back to Hydroponics Daily, the podcast all about soilless cultivation. Today, we're talking about powdery mildew, and that's a subject I think I should have covered already in the podcast because it's a fairly big, common problem in hydroponics, both grow room-based hydroponics and greenhouse-based hydroponics. It's probably the most common fungal disease. Well, I know it is. It's the most common fungal disease. Now, lots of plants get powdery mildew. Every plant apart from conifers. Conifers are immune to powdery mildew. They get other diseases. They get a lot of things like rusts and rots, but they are resistant to powdery mildew. Every other plant, every other crop will be getting powdery mildew. And it's called the same name, but it's actually lots of different species of fungi. And the problem is they all look the same, so they're all given the same name. Most of the ones that are on edible crops belong to the genus Bloomeria. So the scientific name is Bloomeria graminis for those that affect all the grass species and other species of Bloomeria. It's got the same name as the mildew that grows in your house if you've got a soggy bathroom, very moist conditions. However, it's completely unrelated to any molds that you might call mildews in home. And that can cause some problems because we have biofungicides at Utrema that work to control mildew on crops, and then people say, oh, it didn't work in my bathroom. It's like, well, you're not going to activate plant defense mechanisms in your bathroom. So mildew is a term that's just used for any sort of mold, whether it's black mold or white mold. And in plants, as I say, everything that gives a powdery appearance on the leaves is called powdery mildew, and everything that gives sort of like a hairy type growth is called downy mildew. So the downy mildews are not related to powdery mildews, completely unrelated, as related as you are to an octopus. So completely unrelated. They just look similar to the human eye. When you actually get on a microscopic level and a genetic level, completely different. And powdery mildews are far more common, and they are common when you've got really high humidity in the air, high temperatures, and dry soils. So a lot of hydroponic growers like to keep their soils on the dry side, and if you've got a high temperature in the summer, this is where you're going to really struggle with powdery mildew. The good news is that because they're completely unrelated, the different types of powdery mildew on the different crops, you can't get cross-contamination. So if you've got powdery mildew on your tomato plants and your tomato plants share a grow room or a greenhouse with cucumbers, you're not going to get cross-contamination because they can only infect the plant that they've evolved to infect. So that's not a problem. However, the same conditions will stimulate the growth. So wet air, humid air, and dry soils, high temperatures. High nitrogen levels will also stimulate powdery mildew, and a crowded grow room where you've got those conditions of high humidity is going to exacerbate that with having a crowded grow room. So be careful of that. Just when you think about cramming more plants in, having under canopy lighting, powdery mildew will be your biggest problem. So as I say, it's white growth on your leaves. If it starts to turn black, that means it's sporulating, producing microscopic spores. And then you're in a world of pain because you're going to get even more powdery mildew. Your whole installation will be covered in spores. And so you really want to control it way, way, way before you get to the sporulation phase. It's a biotrophic fungus. And by that means it feeds off the plant and doesn't kill the cells. It just sucks the energy out of them, the life out of them. That contrasts with a necrotrophic fungus, which just eats the plant as you go along. So something like fusarium is a necrotrophic fungi, but a biotrophic one, it goes into stealth mode. It's like a parasite in the cells. And that's important because if you do apply things like chitosan, which is a biofungicide, it activates the plant defenses and makes them turn on and recognize the plants. And so the powdery mildew, to get a bit nerdy, actually turns off the plant defenses. It means it can't sense it. And the plants are normally trying to look out for chitin, which is what all fungal cell walls are made of and all pests are made of. The fungus goes in, turns those defenses off, and that's how it becomes biotrophic and leads to an infection. The plant just doesn't know it's there. So if you go on with something like chitosan, a biofungicide, and spray it on, suddenly the plant wakes up and realizes, oh shit, I'm under attack. Okay, so that's one good way of looking at powdery mildew. ways of controlling powdery mildew, obviously quarantining any new plant material that comes in. That's really important if you're growing a plant that's not common in your area, because you're only going to get it really if it comes in on the air it'll go through any inlet filter, so you can't really keep the spores out. It'll come in through vents. It will come, but if you say you've got a plant that only grows, no one grows it near you, and it only normally grows in Japan, then it's going to come in on the plant material. So you've got to be really careful, quarantine it. Or even seeds, you've got to make sure you sterilize them. As we know at Utrema, we deal with a lot of seed companies, and they have powdery mildew issues. There's not a grower out there that doesn't have powdery mildew issues. They can try and reduce the incidence of powdery mildew by growing it in places where there's a lot drier air, warmer conditions in the winter, but they'll still have powdery mildew. Anyone who's growing, a seasonal crop in tropics like Thailand, they'll have powdery mildew. So quarantine is essential. Seed sterilization is essential. There are ladybirds that actually eat powdery mildew, and people have looked at this as a biocontrol. I think they're native to, it might be native to UK, but certainly native to Australia. You get a lot of yellow ladybirds down there. And so there's potential for biocontrol that you could release yellow ladybirds. I don't think anyone does that at the moment. So I said chitosan is a biofungicide. There are conventional fungicides. However, do you want to be eating fungicides? And normally they can't be applied 30 days until harvest, and they can only be applied once or twice on a crop. Whereas chitosan, you can apply at any time. You can apply it up to 8 times, I think, legally in the EU and the UK. And you can apply it right up until harvest because it's, food grade. And you don't need to get your people out of your greenhouse while you're spraying it. So that's really good for commercial situations where you don't want to stop production for 30 days and you don't want to take people out of the greenhouse while you're spraying. So have a look at chitosan. Chitosan is spelled Chitosan. Not, some people call it chitosan. I've heard it called chitosan, but it's called chitosan. You might also want to look at resistant varieties. Some plants, they breed for resistance to powdery mildew. So things like arable crops and also pea crops, whereas in other medicinal plants and things like this, they don't breed for powdery mildew resistance. It's not a big one in hops. It's more like verticillium, fusarium wilts, things like this, where they're going to breed out viruses. They're trying to breed those out. A great example of breeding for success for preventing powdery mildew is sweet peas. So sweet peas normally really do get a lot of powdery mildew. And it's found that wild peas don't get powdery mildew. So they bred in the genes for just conventional breeding by crossing them with the wild peas and then crossing the progeny of that cross with sweet peas. Again, they sort of got back to a sweet pea variety, but crucially still maintaining the powdery mildew resistance they got from the wild pea on the initial cross. So that's really interesting that if you want to go out there and look for powdery mildew resistance in your plant species you work with, maybe you could breed a powdery mildew resistant variety or strain or cultivar. However, certainly arable farmers, they'll know that disease resistance is not a static thing, and some varieties that were once considered fully resistant now get the disease commonly and things like this. So that's something to consider. Don't look at old literature and say, oh, that one's resistant to it, because it might not be resistant. Powdery mildew is an interesting fungus. You'll often see claims from vertical farmers that vertical farms say that one of the reasons vertical farming is great because there's no pest or disease in the grow room in these vertical farms. And I can believe there's no pests, but I can't believe there's no powdery mildew. You think about all those stacks and stacks of plants growing in luscious, nutrient-rich water fertigation solution, and all that requirement to have air being sucked in, unless they've got extremely good filters, I would imagine powdery mildew will rear its head and will need to be controlled, just like any other growing environments. So powdery mildew, I think, is probably more prevalent in vertical farms than people are letting on. It's the number one problem in grow rooms, certainly, because in the summer it's going to get really hot and humid. When you look at ways to control powdery mildew, you will see reports of lots of different homemade solutions working. So people say, spraying milk onto your plants helps control powdery mildew. what else? Let's have a look. I made a list when I was writing my book. And so here we go. So potential standard kitchen spice rack ingredients that people have done studies on: ginger, turmeric, asafoetida, that's an Indian spice, isn't it? Peppermint, mustard. And they've all been found to show effects against powdery mildew. Garlic, field horsetail, Japanese knotweed, oilseed rape, ginger, sweet flag, even some poisonous plants, and the key thing to remember here is that in these studies, very rarely did they spray on a water control treatment onto the control plants. Because in science, when you're doing a treatment to see if it has an effect, you spray water onto the control plants and then you have your extract on your other plants. Whereas these were just assuming that water was not going to control powdery mildew. And in reality, spraying anything onto your crop helps control powdery mildew. And that's because the spores of powdery mildew germinate instantaneously as soon as they're in water. And so they think they're in the plant. And so they produce their long germination tube and try and get themselves into a stomata. And if you're spraying water on them, they're washing off and they're germinating. So spraying anything controls powdery mildew. And that's why you've got all these reports of all these different plants and all these different spices and food ingredients that potentially could control powdery mildew, because people haven't realized they should have been spraying the water on the control to have a fair comparison. When you do that, the results are a lot less infrequent, that you get a good control of powdery mildew. You will see some products that are based on copper for controlling powdery mildew, and especially downy mildew, as we said, is completely unrelated. Don't be spraying copper-based products like Bordeaux mixture. They are extremely toxic to you, the soil, and if you're eating crops that contain copper, it's not good for you. It's a heavy metal. It's residual, and it kills the soil biology. So don't spray copper, even if you think it's more natural than spraying a fungicide. I'd rather eat crops that have been sprayed with a fungicide than sprayed with copper, but preferentially I'd spray them with chitosan as a biofungicide. So that's been Hydroponics Daily for today. A long overdue episode about powdery mildew. Probably do a follow-up because I've probably missed loads about powdery mildew. It's a massive subject and there's loads to consider. So until tomorrow, if you found this interesting, if you know somebody suffering from powdery mildew, then share it with them. If somebody shared this episode with you, you owe them a pint. Get down the pub and get that person a pint. It's hot weather. They could do with it. Okay. Thank you very much for listening. Till tomorrow. Goodbye.